Okay, gang. I'm recording what will be the last video for this class, this online class, for the last pair of readings in our final week of this semester. And I'm talking about this Karma Chavez essay, Beyond Inclusion, and also Charles Morris III essay, Context's Critic. Both of these pieces are coming out of that same Quarterly Journal of Speech centennial issue that the Haughey and Rice essays came out of. So these are all very fresh pieces by some scholars who are known voices in certain areas of rhetorical thought and practice and study. So we're finishing the contemporary theory session with a couple of essays that I think represent the kind of dominant trajectory in terms of like what's happening in rhetorical theory that has a lot of momentum, that has a lot of activity surrounding it. It is this question of sort of alternative rhetorics, queer rhetorics. These are theoretical approaches that are interested in questions of power, dominance, hegemony, identity, subjectivity. So, and the I'm actually recording this before I'm recording the Blair Baxter Brown piece on disciplining the feminine. But that's a great setup. I'm sure I'll be talking about this in a moment. But that piece is a really good setup for these essays, which are really trying to think about rhetoric as a tradition, as a discipline. That word discipline is really key. So rhetoric as a discipline, and what are its main commitments, and what are its main values, norms, assumptions. In order to study rhetoric at all, what are you doing in terms of its most basic assumptions? So there's been a kind of divergence that Chavez is talking about in terms of the Ramey McCarrow stuff, which we'll get back into a second here. I'm just trying to give broad picture. So, you know, starting with the Scott and the Black and what was the other one we read that week? Scott and Black and, Polacos, right? Starting with those essays on thinking about contemporary rhetoric as a kind of neo-sophistic return to the sophistic theories, where language is really important, has a lot of power, where style is important, where creativity is important. This idea of play becomes important, experimentation, novelty, this idea of pushing into the unknown. That's all contemporary, neo-sophistic, postmodern priorities, right? And then we see with the space, materiality, sensation stuff is that we're getting in. This is last week. We're getting interested in questions of sort of the micro and how it is that discourse and power affect us, affect bodies, affect individuals, a kind of everyday way, right? So when we go to the coffee shop or the grocery store or just moving about our everyday lives, we are affected and touched by rhetoric, right? So it stands to reason that you can keep pushing on that and end up in a place where, you know, we're asking questions about how it is that rhetoric or discourse or language or subjectivity is impinged on by power and dominance everywhere, right? And that's kind of where we're at now in sort of this question of where are we headed? Where's rhetorical theory headed? Where we're at? This question of the micro and thinking about influence. When I say micro, I mean molecular, like really, really small. The ways that rhetoric and symbolic stuff is able to influence us in ways that we might not even be aware, including within the field of rhetoric itself. So Chavez and Morris are continuing a conversation that was made famous, let's say, by McCarrow's critical rhetoric essay. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. And the idea, the move there was to suggest that rhetoric itself, going right back to the beginnings, going right back to the most foundational, original ideas about rhetoric, that it could be thought of as exclusionary. right? Because rhetoric's interested in sort of the game of politics, the game of speech. Who gets to play that game? Well, historically speaking, it's been guys, white guys, men, the privileged, those with property, those with educations, those with the sort of the privilege to be able to engage in this sort of game of political discourse and debate and deliberation and so on. So starting back in the early in the 1980s and 1990s, scholars in rhetoric started asking questions about rhetoric's very foundations. The notion that rhetoric itself, as a theory, as a history, as a discipline, that word again, discipline, is key. That it is wonderful as we might think eloquence is, and style and invention and all the rest of it, that these can be perceived as tools of the dominant class in society. So rhetoric itself could be seen as a discipline of privilege and a discipline of dominance, right? In order to succeed in this game of our Western, social existence, one must be able to do these things. But in order to be able to do those things, one must already have access to the education, the resources, the knowledge, the stylistics, and so on and so on and so on, right? So rhetoric, when we say alternative rhetoric, we're really thinking about different ways of conceptualizing rhetoric from the ground up, right? And of these two remaining essays, the Chavez piece is the most explicit and the most pointed in that agenda, right? Which is to say, the entire history and the entire tradition of rhetoric could be conceived of as a singular kind of heteronormative, Western, male, patriarchal enterprise that's all about promoting and preserving the function of the state and the nation. And Chavez is really interested in this question of citizenship. Right back, going right back to the beginnings, rhetoric has been interested in this business of citizenship. Speech that we engage in as citizens with one another to try to, come up with the best decisions to help, drive the ship of the state that we all inhabit, right? But today, there's a lot more voices and there's a lot more bodies and there's a lot more activity that can maybe be covered by this idea of citizenship, and specifically when we're thinking about citizenship in relation to a nation and a state that a lot of people don't feel has their interests at heart, right? So Chavez is taking aim, sort of challenging the very basis of a lot of Western rhetorical thought, and wants to sort of think about rhetoric in terms of this question of otherness, right? So there's a couple of big main moves that Chavez is engaging in here. 8 minutes, okay. The first two basic moves, I would say. Number one is that rhetoric, historically speaking, is exclusionary. It's predominantly white, so let's read here. This is the first paragraph. She says, there is much more evidence of those who came before writing in such a way as to foreclose the possibility of my scholarly existence. So someone who writes from the perspective of feminism, Chicana, radical, she self-identifies in this way. Somewhere on the second page, I think. Yeah, so she says 163 toward the end of that, at the end of that middle paragraph. In my view, it is imperative that we break from that history, not in order that rhetoric may become more inclusive discipline, but so that it may become something entirely different. A discipline constituted through non-normative, non-citizen, non-Western perspectives and ways of knowing and being. So she wants to challenge this dominant tradition of rhetoric that emerges out of a tradition occupied largely by white, property-owning, upper-middle class, educated, heteronormative men, basically, right? And so it's this sort of baby in this bathwater question that I find myself grappling with here, right? So it's, rhetoric can be thought of as a series of techniques and tools and skills and abilities and knowledges and so on that happen to be theorized by certain kind of historically certain people. Do those tools and those knowledges and those abilities inherently go together with the people who originally studied them, spied them, practiced them, and so on? Can you separate the baby from the bathwater, essentially? Or in order to get rid of the patriarchy that gave rise to this knowledge, do you also have to get rid of the knowledge, right? And I think she's in this sort of like throw the baby out with the bathwater idea. That rhetoric's foundations are so tied to the dominant ruling class that we should strive for not inclusion. That's her next main argument. Two main arguments. First one is the history of rhetoric as a discipline is exclusionary. The second main argument is that we should not want inclusion. Why? Because we are wanting to be included in a game that is exclusionary, right? So what we should be wanting is to sort of break, dissolve, deconstruct, dismantle this dominant tradition and open up space for radically different ways. Now, here's a question I would ask you to think about. Go back to the Polakos essay where he finishes in this whole business of man desires to be other, right? That's a key part of his whole neo-sophistic rhetorical enterprise, is to suggest that this question of kairos is respecting that which is appropriate, but also pushing into the unknown, the desire to be other, taking audiences into this realm of the unknown. Chavez is saying something quite similar, at least on the surface. She's saying what we need is other. We need other rhetorics, other voices. And I'd be curious to know what you think about. Like, is that similar to what Polakos is saying, or is it different? Anyway, those are the big broad strokes of Chavez's piece. The historical discipline of rhetoric is exclusionary. We should not strive to be included in that tradition, but to radically re-envision rhetoric in different ways. Okay? So we should not strive for inclusion, because inclusion is including in an exclusionary game, and that's not where we want to be. So some of the key moments here. She says in the first, sorry, skip over that. So she talks about deeply entrenched biases, top of 163. As McCarroll argues in an earlier essay, rhetoric constitutes an administrative rhetoric, distribution of resources necessary for the maintenance or alteration of power. Yes, these deeply entrenched biases already have been highlighted by feminist, queer, critical race, post-colonial, and decolonial scholars, among others. Our field is constituted through the dominant norms that McCarroll and others have identified. Certainly it deserves further attention. So there has been this enterprise for 20, 30 years now to sort of identify rhetoric's exclusionary norms. And the piece that we will have just talked about, the Blair, Baxter, and Brown piece, does a really good job of identifying through a case study what those disciplinary norms are. They talk about territoriality, they talk about hierarchy, they talk about, I'm doing this from memory here, uniformity or singular voice, and I think self-determining, right? These norms within the academy for how it is that scholarship gets conducted and what we privilege and prioritize and so on. She wants to move past all that. So this idea of citizenship, we don't need to necessarily get bogged down with this, but the idea of citizenship is an interesting one. I think she slips up a little bit personally. If you go back to the origins of rhetorical thought, you know, Aristotle, Cicero, Plato, Isocrates, and so on, they were concerned with citizenship, but I don't know that rhetoric as such was, you know, connected to the nation state, which is a more recent enterprise. That's a 16th, 17th, 18th century kind of set of concerns. So I think she's doing some historical slippage here to suggest that rhetoric is fundamentally connected to this modern nation thing. And she talks about surveillance, the state surveillance on 165 at the top there. She says, the concern in my book, she's referring to a book she wrote, and here is with what happens when we situate all subject formation and civic, community, and activist practices within the framework of citizenship, a framework that cannot be divorced from its connection to state surveillance and control more generally, and its relation with the modern nation state specifically. So, yes, you can draw connections between rhetoric and the state and the polity, which is the political community that we find ourselves a part of, but that's not necessarily the same as the modern nation state, which, yes, absolutely, the modern nation state as we all know, is something that we are hard at work questioning today. We talk about globalization. We talk about, the state's involvement in the economy and its concern or lack of concern for things like environmental degradation, workers' rights, discrimination, and on and on. So the state today has lots of problems that didn't exist in the original formulation of rhetorical thought, going back to Aristotle and Socrates in particular. So I think there's a little bit of kind of shoehorning that's happening here. It doesn't necessarily affect the argument in a fundamental way. The point largely still is true that rhetoric is concerned with politics, with the public, with citizenship thought sort of broadly. At least I think of it broadly in the sense of that community of members who are affected by the decisions and the activities that we engage in as a member of this polity, of this group, right? Seems to me that you can't really get away from some notion of community, of polity, if you are talking about rhetoric. If you're not talking about that kind of stuff, I don't know what you're talking about in terms of rhetoric, right? So I'd be curious to know a little bit more about what she thinks of in terms of what we're going to replace thinking about rhetoric as citizenship with, right? So she spent some time talking about invitational rhetoric, and don't want to get too deep into that. Invitational Rhetoric is an essay that was written by some of the people who wrote one of the books that we've been reading, Foss Trap, right? The Foss sisters and I think Griffin as well wrote an essay called Invitational Rhetoric, and it's meant to be a feminist alternative to dominant rhetorical thought. And it's very much centered around listening and turn-taking, and it's not about the sort of the desire to win over your audience or control their wills and so on. It's meant more about kind of openness and turn-taking and so on. So Chavez is citing invitational rhetoric as an interesting alternative to dominant rhetorics. But she doesn't go too far beyond that. She's talking about a rhetoric of difference. Basically, she wants something that doesn't yet exist, this idea of otherness, the space of otherness. So she says on 167, but the space of otherness is the space in which people, particularly those in power, are able to see themselves as other to another. So she's interested in rhetoric that wants to kind of go in a radically, I think the idea here is to expand the notion of citizenship or expand the notion of rhetoric beyond just citizenship. I think that's probably the case. Like, let's just forget talking about citizenship so much, and let's think about rhetoric more broadly. There are people who, they might not even be citizens, right? We're having this whole discussion and debate right now about citizenship and immigration, and she's writing, I think, in that world of like, what if you don't belong? What if you're not a member of, an official member of the community that you are a part of? Do you not then get to participate rhetorically in what happens in a society? These are tough questions. She's writing from the margin, so to speak, from that space of precarious inclusion or precarious involvement in the larger group. So the question maybe is like, does rhetoric need to cover all voices, all bodies, if they are not part of the official polity, or the official group, community, or whatever? What about non-official? What about marginal voices, marginal members? To what extent does rhetoric need to account for all, universal? And what does that look like? And what does that involve? And so she sort of gets us going in that direction. But we could ask questions about what else would we replace the norms of rhetoric's historical disciplinary priority? What would we replace those? What new norms? What new practices? What new values? And so on. If we're not going to accept inclusion into this pre-existing set of concerns, then what else, right? So she's teeing up invitational rhetoric as one possibility. She says also on 169 at the top there, this view of resistance and transformation acknowledges that black women have to seek inclusion in white spaces such as the academy for material reasons, but that their creativity does not aim ultimately toward inclusion, but in fact offers an alternative vision of rhetoric altogether. That she's just been mentioning the existence of slavery, the kitchen within the institution of slavery, where this strange intersection of femininity and race happens where black female slaves are expected to cook, but their abilities to cook within the kitchen also signal their creativity, their autonomy, their ability to sort of to do new things, to be creative, to have some autonomy. So a lot of kitchens in slave plantations were moved outside of the normal kitchen where the black female slave worker was demonstrating her power, her ability to create and to have knowledge. So it was moved outside where those reminders wouldn't be there. That's an interesting example of a kind of a social space that gets fraught with sort of the dominant codes, but also new resistant culinary codes, right? So I think that's another interesting case that Chavez is talking about, where you can think about the sort of the othering and difference, right? New codes, new traditions, new ways of doing things that exist sort of through the institutionally established space of the kitchen, but also does different things and takes in different places. So the idea here, I think, is like, if you don't exist as part of this disciplinary tradition of rhetoric, historically speaking, you can still operate within the academy. You can still publish in journals like Quarterly Journal of Speech and try to push the discipline in new directions. And I think that's what she's up to here. I'll let you judge the success of it. And then I would just mention in terms of the Morris piece, which is longer, but less direct and less, let's see, time-wise. Oops, I got to wrap up here. It's longer than the Chavez piece, but it's doing largely the same things in a lot softer way. So Charles Morris is the first major queer voice in rhetoric and rhetorical scholarship, rhetorical criticism, and probably still one of the greatest and best and most eloquent voices. And here he's performing his own kind of sympathies with John Murphy, another great rhetorical critic. But Murphy is, white, hetero, cis, and sort of represents that dominant tradition. So Charles is trying to because they're buddies, they know each other, they're top scholars together. So Charles is sort of acknowledging Murphy's analysis of Obama, but also kind of pushing a little bit. So both Chavez and Charles are trying to push the field, trying to push it and broaden it. And Charles is going back to sort of revisit what Murphy's saying about Obama as this sort of champion of LGBTQ rights. And Charles is saying, Morris is saying, it's not so clean, it's not so simple. There's a lot of stuff that gets missed if we just celebrate Obama as a champion of LGBTQ rights. And so he's complicating that history. And so Morris is they're both performing criticism in certain political ways here. Morris is doing it a lot more there's a lot more dancing that he's doing, where he's trying to push but also befriend. He's an ally, but he's also trying to kind of broaden the space of inclusion in rhetorical thought, whereas Chavez is sort of more feels herself as an outsider and is trying to say, hey guys, let's open up space here. Let's stop being so sort of narrow-minded. So they're both trying to push the discipline, and they're both trying to rethink the very foundations and fundamentals of what rhetoric is, how we think about it historically speaking, whose voices get included, whose voices don't get included, how we might be able to expand the boundaries of what qualifies as rhetorical and what that might mean, and whose voices matter, and what norms and values and practices deserve consideration, and so on. So we're ending with alternative rhetorics, because this is really where I think a lot of the heat in rhetorical theory is right now, is in this boundary pushing and redefining what it is to do rhetoric, to be rhetorical, to radically rethink rhetoric in its most original and foundational sense. So we are in both sort of exciting, dynamic, enlivening times, but also in a moment of what's at the core of what it means to do and to study rhetoric. That very question is under a lot of reinvestigation and reconsideration today, and we'll see how it shakes out. But there's a lot of questioning of fundamentals right now, and I think that's nicely captured in these two pieces here. So as always, if you have questions, holler at me in one way or another, and otherwise I hope this helps. I hope it's working. I hope you're learning lots about rhetorical theory and and probably seeing intersections with like the stuff that's being talked about in these pages of these journals, and also the conversations that are and debates and activities that are happening more broadly, socially speaking, in terms of rethinking fundamentals and rethinking fundamentals of institutions and disciplines. There's a lot of that that's happening right now. So it's very turbulent times right now, and that could be a good thing. It could be, you know, a frightening thing. We'll see. We'll see how it shakes out. These are very field redefining kinds of pieces that we're reading here and conversations that we're having. So with that, I will leave off, and we will see each other in web pages and papers and any questions you may have. Cheers.